future classes. So we're talking about Rebekka today. There's a book named Rebekka about her life. She had several different last names. At one point, she was Rebekka Proughton, and in her second marriage, Rebekka was a mixed race person. Her father was probably a slave owner, a white European, possibly Danish. No one knows for sure. And her mother was a slave, and she was sold into slavery, or she was actually taken from Antigua. She's originally from Antigua. Her name was Shelley, and she arrived on a boat in St. Thomas. I think, you remember the date? 1713? She was born in 1713, and she was 7 or 8 years old, so about 1720. And you're Brian?
Yes, sir.
Hi, Brian. Good to see you. How was your spring break?
That was good, yeah.
Good.
That sounds good.
You survived it.
Yeah.
I'm glad you're here. So, around 1720, this little girl, Shelley, 7 or 8 years old, got off a boat from Antigua. She was sent there to be sold in the slave market. She was purchased by I believe it was a Dutch family. Although it was a Danish island, it was a Dutch family who had a sugar plantation. They were part of the Dutch Reformed Church. I assume they were Protestant Christians. Shelley was taken and was put to work in their household as a household servant. At some point, at a very early age, Shelley became activated in her faith, or she became attracted to faith. And there was a Catholic priest passing through, and she sought baptism, and she received Catholic baptism, which did not make her a Catholic necessarily. She wanted to be baptized, and that was someone available to baptize her. And it's assumed that when she was baptized, she was given a new name, Rebekka, which is a biblical name. And so her name is Rebekka. And this is around 12, 13 years old. Her name became Rebekka. She was a baptized Christian in the Beaver House household. They were Protestant believers. And then when Mr. Beaverheart died, probably not pronouncing that correctly. When he died, she became the property of her son, who inherited the plantation. But the son's sister and mother, that is the widow of the one who died, uh, beseeched him to give her freedom, basically manumission. And she became a free person of color working in their household, kind of a member of the family. And it's possible that they believed that Christians should not own other Christians. That was a common belief among some Protestants at that time period, which is one reason why many Protestants resisted allowing their slaves to get knowledge of Christianity or to receive baptism, because they didn't want to lose their labor. But in this case, she was baptized. She did become a Christian, and they gave her freedom. Her name became Rebekka. She became like a member of the family. She was hardworking, responsible, trustworthy, and this was on the island of St. Thomas. She's from Antigua. Now, backing up a little bit, and I don't have my notes. I was going through getting my notes organized, and it's on my other computer at home. This is the problem of having three computers working off of them. So I'm just if I fudge some of the dates, you guys will correct it when you come up. Um, Dates or names or places. I stumble over some of those when I don't have it right in front of me. But I'll give you the basic outlines. A few years before the arrival of the Moravians, there was a slave uprising on the island of St. John, which was just a short distance away from St. Thomas. It's one of the two Danish Virgin Islands, now U.S. Virgin Islands, off the eastern coast of Puerto Rico. Uh, the Were you going to go into this about the Akan uprising? Okay, good. I'll go over that. That's about as far as I'm going to get, and then I'll let you take it from there, and then I'll wrap it up next week. So there was on St. John's Island. It was a typical exploitation colony, as was St. Thomas. I don't remember the name of the scholar, but there's a Jamaican scholar who did a study on the history of the Caribbean, and I should remember the name, but I don't. I'll bring it to you next week. But he sets up ideal types. That's a Weberian methodology. So you set up two ideal types, and then you compare them. So he sets up two ideal types in the history of the Caribbean. One is a um, a colony society, and the other is an exploitation society or exploitive society. The colony society would be like Cuba, where you have Spanish people who come and set up a colony and they try to reproduce their society in Spain. And normally you might have slavery, but the slavery is never a majority of the population. The slave population is always a minority. So the predominant uh, center of gravity in the society is a reflection of Spanish society, let us say. That was the case in Cuba, especially because Cuba didn't take off in sugar production until the 19th century. The other extreme would be what island would be the other extreme? An exploitation economy. Just guess. But give me a specific island. Jamaica became, it didn't start out that way. Barbados is another example. It started out as a colony society, a reproducing British society in Barbados, but then within 20 years, it started veering over to an exploitation economy once they found out what fabulous wealth they could make from sugar production. Haiti is the extreme example, which is the French. In Haiti, you had 500,000 slaves, 30,000 free people of color, and 30,000. When I say free people of color, most of them were mulattoes who are related to the whites, and so many of them were granted their freedom by white fathers. And then you had um, 30,000 white French people who owned the means of production, owned the society, and owned the slaves. Many of the slaves were also owned by the mulattoes who were free people of color. So you had 30,000, 30,000, 500,000. You see the imbalance there? You have a handful of people trying to dominate with brutality and maintain control over a vast population that could easily, if they rose up and they were organized, could easily throw off that those chains and overcome the 30,000 or 60,000 that were in control. That's an exploitation economy or exploitation society. So what he does, I think it was Orlando. Oh, it's coming back to me. What he does is he sets up these two poles. One is a settler colony, the other one is an exploitation colony designed to make maximum profits. And the owners are there to make their money and get out and go back to Europe. Whereas in the settler colony, the people are there to stay and become Cuban, basically. I'm using Cuba as an example. There are other examples also of a settler colony. Probably Puerto Rico would be one. And so St. Thomas and St. John were exploitation economies. You had a huge number of slaves controlled and intimidated by a small number of whites. And the whole purpose, the whole rationale of the economy of the societies was to exploit slave labor and make as much money as possible. And so the guy who wrote that book writes a whole bunch of stuff about what the outcomes are of those two different kinds of societies. And one of them, the exploitation economy, leads to very uh, distorted outcomes, a distorted society, a lot of resentment, violence becomes part of it because violence is inherent in slave ownership, which the Quakers found out to their chagrin. So in St. John, which was like 30 miles away from St. Thomas, and I don't remember the year. If somebody remembers the year, I might be able to find it in my notes here. Um, I neglected to say that St. Thomas had been inhabited by the Carib people. The Caribs were the ones that were more militant and more warlike, more than the Tainos. And in 1672, the Danish uh, rounded up the Caribs and enslaved them, killed some of them, and moved them off the island, and that cleared St. Thomas for settlement. And they also settled the St. John, and then you have the Akan people. So on St. John, you had enslaved people from a number of different linguistic and tribal groups in Africa. Basically, the in the area of the Congo to Dahomey, in that area of Africa, there were a lot of different tribes, a lot of different linguistic groups, and there were people thrown together in this enslaved population from many different tribes and linguistic groups. But one particular group was called the Akan people, uh, the kingdom of Akwamu, and they had a interesting, unique history because the kingdom of Akwamu had just conquered some of the other tribal groups in that area of Africa. And according to the author, I'm not an expert on this, but I'm telling you what the author of the book by Rebekka says. I'm sure he researched it. They had just conquered some of the neighboring tribal groups, and in the African practice, the African slavery was much less brutal than European industrial slavery, shall I call it? I just made that word up, but chattel slavery in these large sugar plantations meant to maximize profits was the most brutal form of slavery ever invented. In African slavery, prisoners of prisoners of war who had been captured in warfare or people who had fallen into debt were often enslaved, but their children it was not inherited by their children, and they weren't they often worked as household servants or in agricultural production, but not under the brutalizing conditions that existed in the Caribbean. And the Aquamo people had conquered some of the neighboring tribal groups and had sold some of the captives of war to the Portuguese and the English to be enslaved. So here's the unique situation on St. John. You had this proud, militarily aggressive, and somewhat superior dominant group called the Akan people who were enslaved, about 150 people who had been enslaved. And you had other slave groups or tribal groups who had been enslaved by the Akan people and sold into slavery by these people who were now their fellow slaves. You tracking with me? And so the Akan people wanted to rise up, throw off the chains of the Danish, and set up a kingdom in St. John's. But they weren't thinking in terms of sharing that liberty with the other slave groups. So the flaw in their plan was it was just them, and they didn't necessarily count on the other slaves rising up and supporting the Danish against them. Nevertheless, they rose up and they had this they had a victory. It was very brutal. Um, I'm trying to remember a name. I'm not getting emotional. I'm just trying to remember a name. This is if I could get anything back from my youth, it'd be my brain. Uh, who does anyone remember the guy who wrote the definitive history of Haiti? HRRR something JR. Oh man. Okay, I'll look it up later. But anyway, he writes a whole chapter on brutality, the brutality of the whites and the brutality of the slaves in the Haitian Revolution. And he show. Do you remember his name? Okay, let me finish my thought here. If you remember his name, let me know. So, and he shows that the brutality of the slaves was provoked by the brutality of slavery, and you can't understand slave brutality in the uprising without understanding the brutal conditions under which they were treated and kept. Yes, CLR. I knew it was several letters. CL. I wanted to go JRR like Tolkien, but it's CLR James. If you're interested in further research on the Caribbean, especially Haiti, I highly recommend his book. Do you have the name of the book there? Yeah. Well, that's a description of it. I think it's called the Rebellion of Saint Domingue. Toussaint Louverture and the Rebellion of Saint Domingue, I think, is the name of the book. But it's fascinating. I highly recommend it if you want to read more about the Haitian Revolution. Um, anyway, so CLR James goes into an entire chapter on white brutality, and then he goes into a chapter about the slave brutality in the uprising, and it puts everything in a perspective. So it was very brutal, and they maintained control of the entire island of St. John's for 6 months, and eventually I'm sorry, not the British, the Danish on St. Thomas were unable to bring an end to the revolution or the rebellion. So they eventually had to call in the British from one of the neighboring islands, I think Antigua, or maybe it was the French. I think it was the French from Martinique. They asked for help from the French to come and send a naval squadron, and uh, some French Marines to put them down. So here is what here's what the author says about this. I thought it was a good point. I'd forgotten this point. So Danish colonial power reemerged as more dominant. The slaves were intimidated more fiercely than ever, but all parties now had to redefine the terms by which they would live together. And the Afro-Caribbean people were forced to weigh anew their responses to the crushing psychological and punitive burdens of captivity. How could the unfree maintain dignity in a society designed to deprive them of it? Such were the questions that the slaves grappled with as an adolescent girl named Rebekka came of age in St. Thomas in the shadow of rebellion. So that's the background. John's Senseback, is that his name, Senseback? I think it is. That's the background he gives, that the people who had risen up against their white um, owners, and even the Africans who had not risen up but had got caught up in that violent upheaval between the Akan people and the Danish, now had this vacuum, this loss of hope. Whatever hope they had been dispelled. Violent rebellion had not worked. And so I think the author is implying that there was this vacuum of meaning, that Rebekka, that comes of age as a 14, 15-year-old girl, and she's about to meet the Moravians who arrive on the island around that time, the first Moravian missionary. And she's going to get caught up in this and provide a different sort of answer to this longing for freedom and liberty, this longing for empowerment of the people of color of these two islands. And that's going to be a role that she steps into, a different kind of rebellion, a different kind of revolution, a spiritual revolution as opposed to a violent revolution. And the author later on, and I'll try to have my notes a little better prepared next week when I pick it up from here, but the author sees her as one of the key people in launching an Afro-Caribbean religious movement, a movement of people of color in the Caribbean and also in the parts of the United States, which at that time were still colonies, towards faith as a source of encouragement, of hope, of empowerment, and providing meaning for their lives. And so, with that, I will turn it over to Angie and Brian.